When it comes to Disfluency, it delivers a nuanced take on a devastating life event in ways that remind you that there is no one way to handle things. So to summarize the film, after failing the final class that she needed to graduate, Jane returns home to a Detroit suburb to recuperate. And while her mom is hard on her and her dad tries to be the champion that he's always been, her older sister Lacey is still quite worried, but over the summer, Jane reconnects with familiar faces, old friends and crushes, and tries to reconcile what happened to her and how to handle it so that it doesn't impede her life again and again. So getting to the review portion, the first highlight for us is that every character plays a role, some bigger than others, but everyone has a part. For example, one of the smallest roles that's fairly consistent on this film is one of Jane's friends who is an influencer. And her importance is that Jane, to try to play catch up, because her major deals with speech pathology, I think it is, her friend being an influencer, going on to about 100,000 followers, and how she talks is of interest to Jane, and she tries to analyze it for her independent study. And as she does this, she also analyzes how her older sister Lacey talks in sort of a comparison state. But perhaps the bigger thing is when it comes to the next highlight is that there's a character named Amber. Amber is somebody who her relationship with Jane is a little bit murky when we're introduced to Amber, but what we do know for sure is that Amber lives a very different life compared to everybody else who lives in this town that seemingly focuses heavily on this lake because it's like upper class type of suburbs. But getting to the point, Amber is kind of an outlier. She had a teen pregnancy, she has a deadbeat baby daddy, and one of the things that Jane kind of helps her with once she's able to get past Amber's walls is help with the fact that Amber's son, originally she thought he had autism or something like that, but really he's just deaf. And Jane, with her knowledge of sign language and her speech therapy education, helps Amber kind of navigate how to not necessarily catch up her son in terms of hitting life stages, but make it so that he can have a life that's productive and can hit all the milestones. And you can see with Jane having to be kind of vulnerable, soft-spoken, everything in order to get Amber to open up, she herself starts to kind of find someone she can be vulnerable with that's not separated to the degree of what a therapist would be, but somebody who's separated from her daily life yet close enough that she can talk about what happened. And with that, you see a sort of balance come between the two compared to everybody else who's trying to help Jane so much that they're kind of stifling at times. Meanwhile, Amber and Jane, there's a balance between what they can give and take from each other to the point where it allows Jane to finally open up. And with that said, the next part that we have to talk about, which is also a highlight, is how it establishes the likely still troubling issues that come with trying to report when someone has assaulted, raped, done something to you that took away your autonomy. And being that I've never gone through the process, I can't say if this is it, but I can really imagine what Jane went through is part of the reason why most people don't want to report. Because the idea of telling one person your story, and they'll possibly have it where they could take their own notes, they're going to have someone to transcribe their notes, and they could possibly get it wrong, so then now the story's getting messed up. Then on top of that, you're going to have to tell the story to a second time to a detective after you got someone who did the intake. That person is now going to start asking people within your friend group, within a friend group of the person who's accused, never mind everybody who's at the party. And let me say this, while I've never been through the process to report rape or sexual assault, in a previous job I've had, I knew someone who got accused in a way that gets handled where they're starting to ask everybody around to the point it becomes common knowledge that someone did something, to the point that HR had to get involved. It really helps you understand why people are so hesitant to report things, because it never becomes a case of I tell an authority figure, they do what they need to do to get me justice. It's you tell an authority figure, they spread your information around to the point where most people can put the pieces together to know what happened. And now it's a case of your reputation versus their reputation. And as you've seen probably in every single form of media, maybe in your personal life as well, all that does is create a messy situation where one or both parties have to leave the environment for sticking around. It's just too uncomfortable. So for the next highlight, it's just the way that Jane handles all that's happening around her. Throughout the movie, she keeps getting asked what happened, because Jane the Brain was literally her nickname. She was on this perfect track record, and then she failed that class. And in the movie, they pursue showing her more imploding and exploding, and it feels like it's more in line with who the character is. And I would even say, as more and more productions address the different ways people handle their autonomy being taken from them, it makes it so having this diverse set of what can happen, what your reaction can be to it, whether it's something as challenging as questioning, was it really assault or rape? Was it just something that made you uncomfortable? Or maybe something far more complicated to, yes, you were assaulted or raped, but you don't know if you want to report it. There's a lot of nuance that is increasingly being shown when it comes to films like this. And while it's very difficult to talk about because finding the right words can be challenging, at the same time, the challenge is what brings value to works like this, because it gets people talking, it gets people to see that there's no right or wrong way to feel about what happened, never mind react to it. And even in terms of Jane's story, you may have issues with it because you may not react the way she would have, but for someone who I would say can see Jane's life and point of view, probably more than others who would go more grandeur with their reaction, it seems more in line with what I could imagine if that situation ever happened to me. So it's kind of, I want to say soothing, but that's not the proper word, but it definitely gives you the sense that you have options beyond just the whole idea of whether or not you're going to report, but options on how you're going to move forward, or even, as Jane does a few times, have yourself a breakdown. The last highlight for us is a sense of inclusion that's included, and I should know, it's a very small part toward the end of the film where it shows that Jane's not alone in the situation, but one of the things that we appreciated was that it was a young man who, after Jane went through trying to report what happened to her and it kind of got around, them noting that they felt unable to go through that process, but not feeling as alone because Jane tried to or else did. It created a sweet moment, and while we don't know a lot of what happened to the young man, at the same time, it's one of those situations where it's like, it's not like a Men Too situation where they're trying to invade something that's going on with women and try to kind of lessen it, but rather give it a sense that there's some form of universality to the type of, I don't want to say damage, but definitely how it could oppress somebody to the point where they either act out, feel less than, or something of that nature. But while there are a lot of highlights, there is also one thing that we're on the fence about, and that's just the fact that this movie technically takes place within about 1 or 2 weeks, and that's everything that happens. That's Jane coming back, reintroducing herself to her friends, having a few days where she kind of has a bit of a breakdown after something happens, and then other situations as the movie goes on. And a part of me is okay with it because pacing wise it makes the movie feel rather quick, but at the same time it's that back and forth that we've mentioned before, when it's like how long it would take you to maybe process all that happened compared to how long it would take Jane. You may think this is maybe too quick, but at the same time, you can tell that Jane doesn't want one incident to derail everything she's worked for, hence her taking independent study during the summer. So, is it necessarily the worst thing that this movie tries to speed through things? Not at all, considering who Jane is. But for other people, it may seem somewhere between feeling a little bit unrealistic or maybe something that feels very much sped through in order to keep that roughly 90-minute time frame that movies try to get to. Overall, as shown by how sometimes challenging it is to talk about this movie, when it comes to disfluency, it presents that challenge of the topic while giving you a sense that it's not something that's taboo. Yes, in terms of asking what happened, there needs to be a certain form of sensitivity to it, but once you get beyond that, there needs to be a conversation in order for it to be where people like Jane have the ability to speak up, for the police to not ask the type of questions which basically push the victim to feel silence before they even try to get justice. There needs to be conversation. For men like the guy that we saw at the end of the movie to feel the ability they have to speak up, you need to have camaraderie, you need to have support, and that's not going to happen if things be silenced. Yes, there might be some awkwardness for when it comes to people who haven't been in that situation, who are uncomfortable with the situation, or maybe have been in the situation and they try to bury that it even happened. But there is a need, unfortunately, to talk about something which I think for women is 1 in 3 and men is 1 in 7, 1 in 8. So clearly it's unfortunate part of human nature to do fucked up things, and hopefully the more that the conversation happens, those numbers expand to the point where it's not 1 in 3, but it becomes 1 in 50, 1 in 1,000, and it hopefully eventually can be phased out.